My name is Will Moore. I am a volunteer out at Tonto National Monument, have been during the winter season for about 12 years now. A frequently asked question is, who found this place? Well, they're asking the right guy, because I'm one of those history guys, and I'm happy to probably tell them a lot more than they ever really wanted to know about who did find that place. And I'll share a little bit of that with you this evening. How many of you actually have been out at the Tonto National Monument? Almost everybody. If you haven't been, we've got an event coming up. Would be a real good opportunity for you to come out. I would like to say a word or two about Bullion Plaza. We've had a long, very supportive relationship with Tom and with the museum here. I think this is something like the third time that I've presented here at Bullion. And I know that we've had a history prior to that working with the community here in Miami. So just a word of thanks for that ongoing relationship. And it's great to see this kind of a turnout tonight. My home's in Mesa. I don't think we could get this many people out for a history lecture in Mesa. When I began volunteering at Tonto, it became real apparent to me that a lot of very careful research and work had been done about the archaeology of the place, but not so much about the history of the place. But just a word or two about who we are, if you haven't been there. It's a national monument that preserves and protects two really large cliff dwellings, some 700 years old, along with a lot of other archaeological sites in the immediate area. And it's located maybe 35 odd miles to the north of you here, overlooking Lake Roosevelt. So again, if you haven't been there, once the wind dies down and the cold weather subsides, it might be a good chance to come on out. So in answer to that question, when people ask me, so who found this place? Well, of course, one answer is that where the monument is now was certainly the home of the Yavapai and Tonto Apache people. But that's not really what the people are asking about. Yeah, they get it that this was Native American country, certainly for a very long time after the cliff dwellers left. But what they're really asking is, in our more recent recorded history, who was it that found that place? But I would certainly mention that as a monument, we do maintain a working partnership with a number of Native American nations, including the San Carlos Apaches, the Fort Apache Apaches, White Mountain Apaches, and some of the Puebloan nations, such as the Hopis and the Zunis. And I've been fortunate to learn some of the important oral traditions of our Native American neighbors who have a real strong connection to our sites out there at the Tonto National Monument. But we're going to narrow our history a little more to what we think of as historic time. So, who do we think perhaps were the first white folks to see the cliff dwellings at Tonto National Monument? It's an open question if early Spanish explorers were in the Tonto Basin. Something you can always get a good argument going as to where the Coronado expedition actually went in Arizona. But there's no hard evidence that the early Spanish explorers actually came into that region. Maybe, who knows? Someone may discover that direct evidence out there on the ground sometime. What we do know is that there was an expedition of Anglo-American trappers that came out of Taos, New Mexico, way back in 1839. A teenage Kit Carson was among them. A man named Ewing Young led an expedition of upwards of 40 American trappers. This was still Mexican territory at that time, and the governor of New Mexico didn't give permission to this bunch of illegal aliens who came into the upper Salt River and looking for beaver. They traveled right through the Tonto Basin and on down the Salt River and on up the Verde River. And no doubt, since they knew they had to be very watchful about the rather carefully guarding Yavapais and Tonto Apaches, that they no doubt saw those cliff dwellings. But there's, again, no record of that. These weren't guys that went back and kept careful diaries. They were mostly looking for the entrepreneurial effort of gathering beaver hides and avoiding the Mexican authorities who hadn't, as I say, who had not given them proper permission to even be out here trapping. So that again is speculation, whether or not they saw the cliff dwellings. We can move into something a little more specific with Captain John Burke. He was an immediate aide to General Crook during the warfare between the U.S. Army and the Apaches. So we're jumping forward now after the Mexican-American War, after 1848, when this part of the Republic of Mexico was made part of the Western United States. So Northwest Mexico became Southwest U.S., and right away there was conflict between the Apaches and the American settlers. And Captain Burke was one of those interesting Army officers who not only was a good military man, but he was real interested in what was going on out here and had a particular interest in the native populations. And on patrol in the winter of 1870, right through the basin, he noticed the cliff dwellings, and in his memoir, published 9 years later, he specifically said that he saw these cliff dwellings not far from Pinto Creek, above the Salt River. As far as I know, that's the first reference to having seen the place and then later wrote it down and published about it. That one we can nail down. Whether there were earlier outside observers is kind of questionable. But Captain Burke, we know he was there. Probably was supposed to be paying more attention to the Apaches, but given that he was who he was also really observing all the stuff around him. And that brings us into the ranching era. And one person who wrote about that era was a school teacher, Angelina Mitchell. She served one term at a schoolhouse, one-room school out in the basin in the year of 1880, and she kept a diary, and that diary has since been published. You can buy it at our bookstore. And she talked about actually taking her students, all half a dozen of them, up to the cliff dwellings. As I read her diary about living with a ranch family under the kind of conditions of ranching in the Tonto Basin in the 1880s, it's occurred to me that the people who lived in the cliff dwellings several centuries before actually had a more comfortable life, I think, than schoolmarm Mitchell. She put up with it for one session, went back to Prescott, married the mining executive, and lived happily ever after. But she does have an interesting story to tell about living there in the basin during that time. Exploration got a little more serious in 1883. A man named Adolphe Bandelier was hired by an archaeological institute back in Boston to explore New Mexico and Arizona and find these kinds of archaeological remains. He was here in Globe, Miami in May of 1883. A local prospector named Hunky Dory Holmes took him out to what's now known as Beshbagawa, as a matter of fact. Hunky Dory Holmes was a part-time deputy sheriff, and he's another whole story. We won't get into him. But Bandelier explored on over the divide into the Tonto Basin. Local ranchers there led him up into Cave Canyon. His journal talks about tying up his horse by the spring that is still there and making his way up through the rocks and the cactus to the lower cliff dwelling and the upper cliff dwelling. He later published his report in 1892, one of the very first written, documented archaeological reports about that site. And he wrote about sites all over the southern Arizona and New Mexico as well. The man seemed to be able to get along with most everyone. His journal talks about visiting with various Apaches out in San Carlos that same spring of 1883. And if you know the local history, you know it was not a happy place in the spring of 1880, or at all in the 1880s. But Mr. Bandelier seemed to get along just fine, and made his way on down to Fort McDowell, on to Casa Grande, and visited several of the sites in southern Arizona. And by the way, as a primary source, a few years ago, I had the pleasure of going to the history library in Santa Fe, and they brought to me the original journal that Bandelier had made his little notes in and carried in his saddlebags during that trip all through New Mexico and Arizona. I'm really glad that somebody else transcribed most of that for a historian to use, because his handwriting wasn't the best. But looking at those pages from the day that he was out at what's now Tonto National Monument, and the little map that he drew in the notebook pages, was something of a thrill. To that kind of primary document that makes this real. So as the 1880s and 1890s wound down, the Tonto Basin was pretty much an isolated and remote place. There was some ranching going on, some prospecting going on, but the cliff dwellings only saw an occasional visitor, and the place was, for the most part, left alone and undisturbed. I love this old picture showing a couple of guys on horseback on pretty much the path that is still used to get up to the lower cliff dwelling, though it's been greatly improved and paved and all the rest since. Not too long ago, a visitor who was huffing and puffing his way up that steep trail said, "Who in the world ever put this trail on such a steep incline?" I showed him this picture, and he said, "Okay, I get it. They were riding horses." So, as I say, the occasional visitor in those days really didn't cause much damage to the place. But let's back up for a minute before we get into protecting of the archaeological site. Tonto wasn't the first place protected. The first federal protection of an archaeological site was not so terribly far away, down here by Coolidge. The Casa Grande ruins was set aside as an archaeological reservation way back in 1892. There was no Forest Service, there was no Park Service, there wasn't even a Bureau of Land Management back in those days. The General Land Office operated the place. And by around, I think it was 1901, they hired a young man who was all of 20 years old, named Frank Pinkley, to look after the place. And young Mr. Pinkley lived in a tent and was the caretaker for Casa Grande Ruins Reserve, as it was called in those days. In 1918, he was made a National Park Service ranger to look after Casa Grande and Timocacri and Montezuma Castle and a few others. In fact, by 1923, the Park Service made him superintendent of all the Southwestern National Monuments. But Tonto wasn't part of that domain yet, though he and Park Service officials were certainly looking at Tonto as a place that ought to be under the authority of the National Park Service. We'll get back to Frank Pinkley a little bit later. Starting back at the turn of the last century was really the era of President Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt has his fingerprints all over Arizona. One of his sons lived out here in the territory. It was still a territory. And so as president, he had a fairly free hand, and he had a real interest in natural preservation and protection. He also had an interest in things like water development. So Teddy Roosevelt was involved with the Reclamation Act and water projects. He signed off on the Antiquities Act, which allowed for preservation of archaeological sites. And he prepared or signed off on many new national monuments as well as new national forests. So a whole lot of what went on right in this area, Teddy Roosevelt has his fingerprints on. One of which, of course, was the construction of what was in those days called Tonto Dam, authorized way back in 1903 by President Roosevelt. In order to build Roosevelt Dam, as it was called later on, they had to build a road from Mesa up to the dam site and improve the road from the dam site over here to Globe. They called that whole thing the Apache Trail, and they called it that because most of the labor building that road were Apaches. But the construction, which finished in 1911, of this dam, the reservoir, the road, had a significant impact, certainly on your town here, but also on our national monument. The impact, positively, of course, is it provided all kinds of flood control and water storage and electric power and all that sort of thing. It also had a negative impact on the site itself, in that while the dam was being built, there were very large construction camps, whole towns of people living and working there. And it's apparent that when people had a little time to spare, the cliff dwellings were an easy location to come and explore. And who knows, you might find Spanish treasure or whatever there, variety of relics. And certainly that was a time period when people were visiting without a whole lot of supervision, and some of the damage occurred. I suspect that any one individual who carved his name in one of the ancient beams probably didn't think he was doing much damage, but when you multiply that by hundreds, we did see some particular damage that occurred during that time period. But it does bring us to an era of protection of places like this. In 1906, again, President Roosevelt signed off on the Federal Antiquities Act, which gives the president the power to set aside public land, protected from settlement otherwise, that has prehistoric remains or historic interest or any kind of scientific interest. A fella named Edgar Hewitt from over in Santa Fe, who had a particular interest in archaeological sites, such as at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, Bandelier National monument in New Mexico. He was a real mover and shaker in terms of getting this Antiquities Act passed by Congress, signed by President Roosevelt. And right away, President Roosevelt made a whole bunch of national monuments, starting with Devil's Tower up in Wyoming. But within a little over a year, he had designated Tonto National Monument in December of 1907. We're one of the oldest. We're number 9 on the national list. As I say to some of our visitors, we may not be very big and we may not be very famous, but we are one of the oldest of the national monuments. But there was no National Park Service at that time. The National Park Service didn't come into being until 1916. The land where the monument was national forest land. Tonto National Forest had just been created by President Roosevelt a couple of years before. So the agency in charge was the Forest Service. Now you can imagine the Forest Service was really stretched, especially with a national forest as big and diverse as Tonto. So they really didn't have a ranger they could spare to look after the place. So what they did basically was franchise it out to the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. Starting in 1916 right up into the 1930s, the railroad company provided a watchman on site. They improved a road and built a parking lot and improved that old cowboy trail up to the cliff dwellings. And then they advertised these great automobile tours. If you are riding the Sunset Limited train from back east to Southern California, you could get off the train in Globe, pay a little extra, get in a big 7-passenger open car, and a driver would take you on the Apache Trail to what they called the Tonto Apache Cliff Dwellings. And they advertised that and the Apache Trail as just this wonderful sight to behold. They were a little bit exaggerating in their hype. For one, they talked all about how the Apaches are no longer dangerous to our travelers. And secondly, that the highway itself is one of the oldest in America, they had to say, and that the cliff dwellings are old as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which they also talked about the pyramids of Egypt. So what's a few thousand years among friends? This advertisement was in Sunset Magazine, which at the time was wholly owned by the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. Another advertisement, again, showing the passengers in the open car. And by the way, if you were eastbound, you could follow the same path from Phoenix, take the Apache Trail in the open car. You would spend a night at a hotel near the dam, and then visit the cliff dwellings. As I said, they called it, and their sign, it's hard to read in this picture, but the sign that they had posted says, "Ancient Cliff Dwellings of the Apache Indians," which again is only off by a few centuries. And something that really became apparent to me as I worked some of these historic photos, notice how tall the walls are there in the lower cliff dwelling. When you come to visit us, you'll note that those walls aren't nearly that tall anymore. So even though the Southern Pacific was in charge, they weren't preventing the damage that still continued. I think they helped to put a bit of a kibosh on some of the vandalism, but it obviously still continued because particularly that big tall wall there in the middle, most of that has been lost since. It wasn't standing by the 1930s. So the railroad company did some good in terms of creating some infrastructure. They did some good in terms of having a person there to at least slow down the rate of vandalism and of carrying off of artifacts. But their interpretation was a little dicey. Older than the pyramids, really? The National Park Service found themselves reorganized in 1933 and 1934. A different President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, had authority to reorganize federal agencies. And so what he did was take all of the national monuments and put them all under the Park Service. So now Tonto and 5 other monuments here in the Southwest became part of the Southwestern National Monuments, a special administrative unit of the National Park Service. With Superintendent Frank Pinkley, he's the guy on the far left there, in charge, working out of the headquarters at Casa Grande National Monument, down near Coolidge. And one of the first things that Boss Pinkley needed to do was put some rangers in charge out of these various places. And so we got our first National Park Service ranger in the summer of 1934. He was all of 25 years old, young man who had graduated from Denver University a few years before. I had the great opportunity several years ago to sit down with his adult son and daughter. Charlie Steen III is a retired professor over at UNM in Albuquerque. His daughter was living in a retirement village in Scottsdale. And Professor Steen was willing to tell me all kinds of stories about his dad's career with the National Park Service. And daughter Allison said that her grandparents, her father's parents, weren't all that impressed with their son getting an anthropology degree in 1932 at the height of the Great Depression. What in the world was he going to do with that kind of an education? Well, he went to work for the Park Service, is what he did. And in that summer of 1934, he became our first ranger. Right away, he began taking people on tours to the cliff dwellings. He began showing them artifacts. He began listing all the different birds that are in the monument. He did all the stuff, basically, that we do to this day there in the monument, except that he was pretty much on his own as a one-man operation. He did have a residence, this little stone building the railroad company had built back in just a few years earlier in 1932. This was the residence for the watchman for the railroad. When Charlie Steen took over, this was part of the infrastructure that he inherited from the railroad company. A little stone building, very close to the parking area, and sort of just across the way from the trail up to the lower cliff dwelling. And from the lower cliff dwelling, you could make your way to the upper one. And he was taking people to both of those places. This served as the check station when you were arriving as a visitor. It served as a museum because Charlie put some artifacts there for people to see. And it served as his residence. He slept in the back room. But one of the things that Charlie Steen was particularly interested in doing was to actually bring some science to the interpretation of what these cliff dwellings could tell us. And a resource that was really available to him, readily available to him, was the Gila Archaeological Institute that was right over here in Six Shooter Canyon, the other side of Globe. It's now the campus of Gila College. But back in the 1920s, a man named Harold Gladwin and his wife, Winnie Gladwin, set up this institute. Mr. Gladwin was a retired stockbroker from New York who had a lot of money and wanted to spend it productively. And so he learned about archaeology by going to work at a museum in Los Angeles, and then came to Globe, Arizona to set up this institute, because this was absolutely fresh ground for archaeological research. He and his staff pretty much defined what Salado archaeology might be. Emil Howery was on his staff. Mr. Howery went on to become the director of the anthropology department at the University of Arizona. He's really one of those grandfathers of Arizona archaeology. And in one of Charlie Steen's reports, he talks about Mr. Howery coming out to do tree ring analysis at the cliff dwellings. The kind of pottery that you see here really is the definition of Salado archaeology, the Salado culture in this region. And if you ever want to get an argument started among archaeologists, just ask them what Salado means. You'll get everything from, well, maybe it was a language group, or maybe it was a cultural group, or maybe it was just a style of pottery. But it is a style that extended certainly from the cliff dwellings out at the monument all the way up into the upper Gila River. Archaeologists and various collectors have found this beautiful three-color geometric design pottery, which is the signature of the ancient culture that was in this area. Go to the museum at Beshbagawa and you'll see wonderful examples again of Salado pottery and other artifacts. And a lot of that basic research was begun by Mr. Gladwin and his staff out here at Gila Pueblo. By the way, Gila Pueblo later on became the National Park Service regional headquarters for archaeology, and then finally was deeded over to the county and then became Gila College. And if you go to Beshbagawa, it's not a bad idea to go a little further up the canyon to visit the campus at Gila College, because it's an old pueblo itself. The nice ladies in the ad building will give you a printed walking tour, and you can do your own archaeological investigation there. One of the great sources of information about these early days of the Park Service at Tonto comes from the fact that Boss Pinkley, in his headquarters down at Casa Grande, wanted a monthly report from each of his ranger custodians at all of these national monuments across the Southwest. So Charlie Steen and all of his colleagues every month would write a Dear Boss letter. He didn't want a formal federal form. He wanted a letter talking about what was going on out at the monument. And so from way over in New Mexico at the Capulan volcano to way down at Tumacacari, all of those national monuments, the local ranger custodian every month would send a letter to Boss Pinkley. He would get them all typed up, mimeograph them, bind them, and send them back out to his rangers. In the era before Facebook or other social media, this was the way that Pinkley brought cohesion to this really widespread group of rangers that were scattered really in 4 different southwestern states. And what's kind of neat is that the bound copies of those old reports still sit on the library shelves of all the national monuments in the Southwest. So a really good introduction that I enjoyed was sitting in the little staff room at our administration building and opening the volumes from the 1930s and reading what Ranger Steen had to say about his months there at the Tonto National Monument. Steen didn't stay terribly long at Tonto. Boss Pinkley tested him out in a number of different places just to see how good a potential archaeologist he really would be. So he sent him up to Montezuma Castle. He brought him down to Casa Grande. And by the fall of 1935, Charlie had been promoted to be a regional archaeologist for the whole Southwest. So we'll run into him a little more out here at Tonto. In fact, we run into Charlie again in the winter of 1940. By then, the Park Service was pretty well established at Tonto National Monument. New custodians, as they were then called, had taken over to run the place. Charlie, as a regional archaeologist, was brought back to Tonto in the winter of 1940 to stabilize some really difficult situations up at the upper cliff dwelling. There's a picture of Ranger Charlie, archaeologist Charlie, at the upper dwelling in what he called his problem child wall that was near collapse. Well, he couldn't do the kind of stabilizing work by himself, and so a real special unit of the Civilian Conservation Corps came to help do the work out at Tonto. You've probably heard of the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the most popular programs of the New Deal to put young men to work right across the country. This was a special unit. The Park Service sponsored what they called the mobile unit. They were all Navajos recruited in northern New Mexico to do the work of archaeological repair and preservation. Pretty unusual circumstance, but these young men were trained and became experts at this kind of work. The picture here on your left is actually not at Tonto, that's at Chaco Canyon National Monument, now a historic park. And just one glimpse of the Navajo men that were in the mobile unit. They called it the mobile unit because these guys were worked all around the Southwest, including at the upper cliff dwelling at Tonto. That picture was taken later in the spring of 1940. A man doing some careful trenching work in the back of the cave at the upper cliff dwelling. The CCC, the Conservation Corps, went out of business when the Second World War began, and units like this were disbanded. But I think it's worth mentioning that many of the Western tribes particularly still have archaeological departments, and kind of a sequel to the Navajos working at Tonto 80 years ago. We recently appreciated the work of the White Mountain Apache Archaeological Division, who came and helped us with some survey work right back at the upper cliff dwelling. The mobile unit and Charlie Steen did some very important stabilizing work at the upper cliff dwelling back in that winter of 1940. But that's been more than 80 years ago. And since that time, the same wall that he worked on, the problem child wall, became a problem grandchild, and another wall as well. So if you visit the upper cliff dwelling these days, there's some serious stabilizing work that has to be done again. Not a big surprise. The rebuild, the patching up that was done, I can imagine Charlie thinking to himself, Well, decades from now, they'll have probably some new methods to be able to deal with this kind of problem. Well, same old, same old. We're still trying to deal with that kind of a problem. By the way, just kind of an aside, that same spring of 1940, boss Frank Pinkley called all of his rangers back to Casa Grande for the first inter-park conference for all of his rangers scattered throughout the Southwest. First time he had been able to get the funds together to bring all of, as he referred to them, his outfit together there at Casa Grande. He got up on February 14, 1940, to greet the Rangers and their families, gave a welcoming address, sat down in his chair, and died. It was really a traumatic and dramatic ending of Boss Pinkley's career. The Rangers went ahead and said, you know, what would Boss Pinkley want us to do? He'd want us to finish this conference, and that's what they did. And a few days later, they buried him at the Pioneer Cemetery just outside Florence. You can visit Boss Pinkley's grave if you're so inclined. But it was a real traumatic interference with the kind of work that was going on in the monuments, because the Rangers really did count on Pinkley as their mentor and boss. When I visited with Charlie Steen's son, Professor Steen, he said that when his dad would get together with his old Ranger buddies, they always told stories about Boss Pinkley. He was the guy who held them together. As you can see by the picture, the infrastructure was pretty minimal out at Tonto in the 1940s. The Ranger lived in this wall tent, having converted the old stone building entirely into a museum. Before the war, there really wasn't much in the way of financing for, frankly, any of the national parks, and certainly not for the national monuments. There were some improvements that did take place during the war. The Ranger actually, on his own, collected materials to build the little Ranger cabin. It was finished in 1943. When you visit the monument, if you go to the little amphitheater area on the south end of the parking lot, this little Ranger cabin sat there. You can see up above it is the lower cliff dwelling. A few years later, after Charlie Steen got back from his Army service in the war, he and his family put in a month living in that cabin because the regular Ranger was taking some vacation. And Allison, his daughter, who was 6 years old at the time, said, my little brother found a Gila monster, and Mom found a scorpion in the sugar bowl, but I found a coral snake. And she was quite proud of the fact that she had found all that stuff at the ripe old age of 6. With greater funding that began in the 1950s, some more work was done at the monument, particularly at the lower cliff dwelling. If you've been to the lower cliff dwelling, as you walk up to the trail toward the base of the cliff dwelling, you'll see that there's a retaining wall, a little terrace area, some handrails. That was all built in the 1950s. The federal government began to put some big money into national parks with a project they called Mission 66. Began in 1956, finally, for the most part, finished out in 1966, hence the name. But some of the first important work at Tonto, after finally getting the Ranger a decent house, was to stabilize, excavate, and make access more safe there at the lower cliff dwelling. So oftentimes visitors will ask as they go up those last few steps to the dwelling, when did all of this come about? And then finally, to sort of climax the Mission 66 for Tonto National Monument, a new visitor center was finished in 1964 and dedicated in February of 1965. It was quite the big hoopla. There were probably officials from here in Globe, Miami that came out for the dedication. The little parking lot was just jammed, and we got a new visitor center at that point, the same visitor center that you will see now when you go there. Though at that time, it was not only the museum and information desk, but was also the administrative offices. It was pretty much the whole program. Since that time, a new administration building was built some 15 years ago. And as an historian, the downside of building the new visitor center is they tore down the old stone building. Of course they did. It wasn't historic yet at that time. So it's kind of sad that we can't point out an historic structure across the parking lot. But that pretty much brings us to the end of what I consider our historical story. But of course, our story continues. In more recent years, we've had fires, we've had floods, we've had COVID, all of that I'm sure future historians will talk about. I was talking to a visitor at the lower dwelling the other day, and we talked about, fire and flood and COVID, and she said, well, probably zombies will be next. So you never know. But I would like to again invite you. We've got a special event coming 2 weeks from this weekend. For 3 years, we've not been able to do our Heritage Days celebration that we've always done in March, but we're starting that again this year. So Saturday and Sunday, want to make sure I get the dates right. Saturday and Sunday, the 4th and 5th. The place will be open. There will be special demonstrations of crafts and things like that. The trail to the upper dwelling will be open for people to go. You know, usually that's a ranger guided tour. Remember I told you that we were having ongoing stabilizing problems up there. So you'll be able to go up to the outside of the upper cliff dwelling, and a ranger there will be able to tell you about it, but you won't be able to go back inside like you could in earlier years because the place just won't withstand that kind of traffic. Our history continues with the kind of stabilizing and protection that we were set up to do. And so with that, offer the invitation for you all come out in a couple of weeks. And if you've got questions, I'd be glad to field some. Yes, sir.
Sir, about 20 miles northeast of the Tonto National Monument are several cliff dwellings out there. How does the Forest Service interact with those I believe it's Coon Creek or Cherry Creek out there?
Yeah, if you go on out on the Cherry Creek Road into the Sierra Ancha, and also other sites that are in national forest land are important archaeological sites. And the monument works with the Forest Service, particularly for those sites that are right there in the basin. The best protection that the Forest Service provides for those really remote sites is basically not to tell anybody where they are. And so those people who are careful enough to do their research and figure out where they are usually people who are careful enough to respect and help preserve those sites. I've talked to many people who have been to some of the cliff dwellings, and they said, they're in reasonably good care. But I could tell by visiting with those individuals that they have considerable respect for those places. And just a plea, if you do come across an archaeological site out in the public lands, respect that as the outdoor museum And more importantly, it's the ancestral homes of our native neighbors. And those places are to be respected as such.
One follow-up
Go ahead.
question. Were those cliff dwellings in the same era as the Tonto, or were they, do you know that?
And that's something that archaeologists really like to argue about. Probably a little older. One of our former archaeologists, Dwayne Hubbard, suggested that those might have been brief stopping places as the Puebloan people migrated from up on the Colorado Plateau to finally building the cliff dwellings at Tonto. Don't have any proof of any of that, but it's an interesting concept. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked about problem walls. Was that caused by rain and snow and wind? Yeah.
A lot of it, yes. The most problematic walls we have are actually outside the lip of the cave, and natural erosion, rain, snow. You know, a couple of years ago, there was even a little bit of an earth tremor. That didn't help. Most of the human damage has been pretty well stopped, though even a little bit of human traffic can add to the problem. But I was talking to our park superintendent today, and he said, you know, it's still a dilemma for us. How much do we just let things go ahead and naturally deteriorate, which probably the original builders had in mind when they left, and how much do we preserve it for future generations? That's a problem the Park Service has wrestled with for decades.
Yeah, I built lots of walls working underground, and the problem with that was pressure.
Yeah. And our problem tends to be a combination of nature and human traffic. Yeah. Other questions?
How many people live there?
How many people live there? Another thing we can always argue about. Our general hypothesis is that each of the large rooms at the lower cliff dwelling, for example, were families' apartments. 12 or 15 families maybe at the lower dwelling. 20 families possibly or more at the upper dwelling. Maybe 120 people in the canyon between the two cliff dwellings. You know, they didn't leave us a census. So again, we can only do an estimate. But it was a fair-sized community there in the canyon. And they could look out from those cliff dwellings and see their neighbors down along the river, all those irrigation canals and farm fields and the big pueblo that's there at Schoolhouse Point. It always reminds me that a lot was going on in this territory a long time before Columbus happened to show up down in the Caribbean. And it's well worth looking into and learning about and thinking about. Yes, sir.
So my grandfather worked for the Southern Pacific. I'm very interested. I mean, I knew some of what you said, but as the National Park Service came into being and we had federal people taking care of what would become the monument, did the Southern Pacific stop doing its trips, or how did that phase out?
There was some overlap, not very much overlap. And one of the gaps that I see is Ranger Charlie visited with the Apache caretaker, a fellow named Henry Peoria, but he didn't write down and include in his Dear Boss letter what he learned from Mr. Peoria, and that's really too bad. And I'm not sure how long that overlap took place, but at least for several more months, though the Southern Pacific no longer kept a watchman there. That was now Charlie's job. But they did continue to bring the open car visitors for at least several more months, possibly years. That's one of those things that's hard to track down. Maybe I can find Southern Pacific archives someplace. Other questions?
The Sierra Wilderness has a lot of ruins in it.
Yep.
Are they trying to keep it a secret, or?
Yeah, that's the best preservation.
Okay.
You go look at the Forest Service map, it doesn't say where those ruins are. Yes, sir.
When I first visited the upper ruins years ago, there was a skeleton under, it was a baby skeleton under glass
Yeah.
in there. That skeleton is no longer there. Can you give me some history on that?
In recent years especially, we've been listening to our native neighbors a lot more closely than in earlier years. The fact that archaeologists dug up burials is anathema to our native neighbors. Kind of like you might feel if somebody dug up your grandmother's grave in the church cemetery. So we've been asked, frankly, don't even go there about the burials that we know were within the monument or in other places. And out of respect for our native partners, our answer to that question is, I'd just soon not talk about it. So I'm not going to go any further with that. Yes?
Do we know why the ruins were abandoned originally?
No, not for sure. The tree ring data tells us there was a long time of drought. Some of the architecture over here at Gila Pueblo says there was fighting. No doubt there were all kinds of stressors that caused people to want to leave. Last spring, I had the really good fortune that on one of my tours to the upper dwelling, there was an older Hopi man and some of his family that went on the tour. And he was willing to share some of the Hopi story about the place. And as I finished the tour, I talked about, here's some of the reasons people might have left the dwelling. And then I turned to him and said, so what do you think is the rest of the story? And he said, yeah, it probably drought and there might have been fighting, but he said, we believe as Hopis that these people right here at the dwellings knew that they hadn't found the right place yet. And that they joined us. They came up to the Hopi villages at about that time period. They were new clans to us in the mid 1400s. That makes a lot of sense to me too. People all through human history have moved around to try to find the right place. And according to that Hopi elder, the people who left the cliff dwellings in Tonto did find the right place, and their descendants are still there at the Hopi dwellings. I think that's a pretty interesting story, and they don't necessarily have historic evidence, and neither do we. So I like sharing that story. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for being with us tonight.